Now, let's try to look at this external loss data, which is primarily one of the major inputs for computing the operations risk capital. We do we know that there are four important components that are calculating the operations risk capital, especially when we are using the advanced management approach of Basel II. We depend on internal loss data, we depend on external loss data, then we will look at the scenario analysis, and finally we also look out for the business environment and the internal control systems. All these four are going as an input in terms of development of a model which is used to compute the operations risk capital. So, a good understanding of this external data helps us to gain good amount of insight, typically in terms of what are the different kinds of losses, what is the frequency of different kinds of losses, what is the severity of the different kinds of losses, not necessarily in my organization, but more or less with respect to the competitors, or more or less with respect to the industry, so that a lot of things we can do a kind of a learning from the mistakes of the others. So there are so many benefits that are going to come out. So developing a key understanding towards the same, along with understanding the limitations of that, because not always all kinds of external data could be useful. So we really need to understand what is useful, what is not, how it is useful, because to a large extent, by relying on the external data, we can get into the self-assessment of the risk. I can compare myself to what extent my company is better in terms of risk management procedures compared to that of my competitors. Probably those data can create a scenario analysis for me, can go as an input towards my scenario analysis, because historically that particular event might not have occurred in my company, but because it has occurred in some other firm, I can try to use it as a what if analysis for my particular firm. What if this particular problem occurs in my particular firm? So it helps me, the external analysis, external loss data, having a good understanding of it can help me even in developing my KRIs, key risk indicators, which can help me track my performance or identify where I need to improve with respect to my risk management activity. Here, some of the important things that we look out is major external events. They come out in the news headlines of the press, right? If there are major external events, some big scandals occurring, some fraudulent activities occurring, some kind of damage occurring to some physical assets, right? Some employee doing a big fraud within an organization. All these things come as a part of the news headlines in the press, and so which means the more and more I scan through it, I get very important information which probably I should be able to digest and try to implement as a part of my improvement activity. So I need to understand the importance of each one, and it really helps me at least to build a kind of a risk culture within the organization. Yes, this particular my competitor did not follow practices 1, 2, 3. That's the reason the internal fraud has occurred in that company. So I can use that as a base to motivate my employees to develop that risk culture within the organization. So at least the external data can help any organization in developing that kind of culture quite comfortably. Probably if I look at the issue that has occurred at Societe Generale, Probably it may not be something that is occurring in every company. A rogue trading activity. We had so many instances of rogue trading in the at least last 30 years. But still these kind of problems are occurring, right? And concealing of the accounts. And this problem was nowhere between, I mean, it was a very recent as 2006. In 1995 kind of a time frame, we had a similar problem of rogue trading activity with respect to bearings. Now, did we learn anything from the others' mistakes? If similar kind of rogue trading activities, similar kind of fake accounts creation, similar kind of transaction hiding, if they are all happening, what is that we are learning? This is a huge story of 4.9 billion euros, which is not a very, which is one of the biggest scandals in the history. And even after that, in 2011, we had a similar activity at UBS. Now, are we really learning from them? But that is where a good understanding of the external loss data will help us in trying to improvise our understandings. Now, where all can we get the external data? Probably the press is one source, undoubtedly, because we get all such kinds of news articles, journals, newsletters, a lot of stuff do publish a lot of this information. And there are a lot of databases which are maintained, and regarding the databases we talk about two major ones, one being the IBM's AlgoFirst, a very prominent database in terms of the operations risk, but the prime source for this is more from the press and secondary sources. Whereas at the same time we have another operational risk database called as Operations Risk Data Exchange. The Operations Risk Data Exchange, which we typically call as ORX. Now this is the one where the data is gathered purely from the member banks. A lot of banks and financial institutions are the member of this particular exchange, and this exchange is actually maintaining a repository of all the various operations risks that operations related losses that have occurred. But of course, who has supplied it, what is so that entire information is kept confidential. At least the company names and all are not revealed, but it still provides a useful repository for in terms of definition of the events, consistency is maintained, and in terms of more and more operations related losses that are faced by the banks, they themselves are reporting. So there are access to various databases, and there are different kinds of consortiums like this which are typically coming together for a common cause and trying to come out with this data collection process. But whatever is the mechanism, at least the major importance that I look at it is for my benchmarking purpose. I can very well look at the external data to benchmark myself. Are my losses, are my firm's losses reflective of the industry? Industry, if I had faced severe loss, is it like the whole industry is facing similar kind of a situation, or am I doing something different from the industry? So patterns wise, I can match my company's patterns with that of the industry as a whole. So it really helped me in terms of evaluating the external data. And regarding the databases, IBM AlgoFirst or ORX, they contain various operational risk events which are gathered from various sources. And now I can collect that data. I can subscribe to that particular database. As a company, I'll subscribe to that particular database. For me, the most important thing there is not look at item by item and see whether I can mitigate this risk or not, or do I really face this particular risk or not. I'm not looking at it item by item. I am trying to look at classifying it probably into appropriate business lines, okay, to what kind of businesses these risk is applicable to, categorize it based on the risk categories. Is it relating to fraud, or is it relating to the damage to the physical assets, or is it relating to a system based failure, what category it is, and also get some heavy information with respect to tail losses. It's very much possible that if I am looking more from my internal data, it might not be possible to capture a good number of tail losses. But if I am relying heavily on the external data, the tail losses capturing is much more comfortable, because some loss might have occurred in some company or the other. So the data capture with respect to tail losses become easy when I am looking out for the external data. And we know that in typical scenarios, the operation losses, they get classified either as business disruptions, the major 7 broad categories. Either I should look at it as a business disruption and a system failure, one major activity. Then we have internal fraud, which the fraud within the organization. Then we have external fraud, which is typically the fraud by outsiders towards the organization. Then we have clients, process, products related practices, which is again an operations risk. Right, this is the one major source of operations risk. Then we have damage to physical assets within the organization, so which is another major source of operations risk. And employee related practices, the workplace safety and all fall under the another category, and other thing relating to execution, delivery and process management. So all these various categories, at least I can see in which category the risks are more higher, and within each category what is the kind of what is the frequency of occurrence of the losses, what is the severity of the losses. All that will help me in terms of building a model and building a strategy where I can very well reduce them. So here the two majorly used data sources, one being the IBM's AlgoFirst and the other one being the ORX. As I said, the sources of data for both of them are different. So probably the AlgoFirst is more and more relying on external data, more towards the press, whereas ORX is more and more member contributed. That's the reason probably if I am looking at the distribution of the frequencies or the distribution of the severities, we could get different numbers from different databases. If I look at, for example, if I look at here, so here internal losses, right? I see the internal losses data is much higher here, whereas it is much lower here. Why? Any internal loss data, even if it is occurred or if it has not occurred, generally hits the highlight news headlines quite comfortably. Whereas members may not contribute that data in detail to the exchange because it's something internal to their organization. So probably the data may not be contributed much. Similarly, if I am looking at execution, delivery kind of issues, process management issues, let's say here it could be much higher, whereas it may not be higher here, because these may not hit the headlines at all. The execution related problem, they may not come in the external sources, they may not come in the press, right? So if they are not reported, they are not going into the AlgoFirst. Similarly, so there could be collection bias that could be there in all this. At least with the AlgoFirst, I can categorize something as collection bias, whereas with ORX, I'll call the same as reporting bias, because a lot of companies may not report a lot of losses of different kinds of severities when it comes to the member banks. And here we even are having a survivorship bias, because it all talks about whosoever are the member banks, they are only contributing. Any of the member banks, any of the banks which are not members, the contributions may not come from them, but they may go to the public in the form of press. So the collection bias could exist in both of them. And if I look at the same, here the external fraud data is much more, because always the competitor tracking is much more by the members. So anything that is happening towards the members, they try to towards their competitors, they try to take advantage, they try to report the same. So external fraud data is much more, but those kind of events, someone else intervening into my system, it may not get into the notice of the press at all. So all these reasons wise, we see that even from the business line wise, we see that here it is more and more focused towards retail banking, whereas here you will find more and more losses towards commercial banking. Again, the same reason, lot of activities within the commercial banking segment, they go towards the press, whereas with the retail, they may not reach the press at all. But whatever it is, at least a reliance on external data, if I start looking at the positives of it, there is a lot of advantage, but at the same time I need to understand what are the limitations. As long as I understand the limitations and use it within the scope of limitations, it is very much helping me in doing a big model, good model. See, one, I can rely on the databases, but at least I have my own research. Internally, I have my own research team. So obviously, I'll definitely use the external data with some caution. I may not use each and every. Because on one side, when I really look at the media, probably we know, they want to highlight the items as per their requirement. Right? They decide which one is a headline and which one is a not. They decide which news to really suppress and which news to highlight. So what could happen is some of them get overblown, whereas some of them get completely masked. And more towards illegal or some kind of breaking news kind of events, they cover quite highly compared to smaller ones. So probably if there is a fraud, yes, all media is completely in that direction. But if I am talking about a system being down, some operational maintenance issue coming up, if that operational issue comes up probably with some big firm like a Google or a Microsoft, probably it might get highlighted, but for a small firm, it hardly gets noticed. So that, with a pinch of salt, that information needs to be understood. Right? So, and even probably you should understand, if there is any major loss, they are going to highlight very heavily. But if a similar gain is there, they may not even bother to cover it for any organization. So there could be some limitations in the way the media is typically acting. So the external research databases should be used with that kind of a caution. Then, one thing that is always suggested when we are using external data is don't look at the exact events and try to see whether I can mitigate that event or not. Always focus in terms of types, the frequency of each of the types. So look at it more from an aggregation perspective or an average kind of a perspective or a distribution kind of a perspective, but never look at it like one-on-one kind of a basis, right? So probably, is there a similar kind of a loss? Use that as a benchmark rather than one-on-one kind of stuff. So as long as I am able to use the external data, understanding the limitations, it can really provide lots and lots of lessons to me without me incurring those heavy losses. And it can help me help any organization in implementing the risk management practices quite comfortably across the industry. and make sure to a large extent that the risks which have occurred within the in the past with any of the competitors, I can very well take extra caution to make sure that I will not repeat those kind of mistakes. Though in a lot of cases we are seeing that these kind of mistakes are repeating again and again, like the example of Societe Generale. That's one of the prime reasons we are trying to look at again the Societe Generale example to typically understand what exactly has gone wrong. Again, it's an essentially a rogue trading activity involving in a scandal of 4.9 billion euros. But apart from probably the person being sentenced to prison and all that stuff, some of the major problems that were faced by Society General later on, it's a reputation issue, and at the same time, even it has to raise additional capital to meet the capital requirements. So, for meeting the capital requirements, additional funds were supposed to be raised. And what it has really done is unauthorized trading positions, still again futures and equity securities, similar to what we see in Barings Bank. Nick Leeson has done similar kind of a strategy. So there are n number of instances of a similar fake transactions being created, and those transactions are closed before they are getting confirmed. So the number of closures or cancellations are much higher, and there was no check. So lots and lots, thousands of fictitious trades have been conducted without any kind of check, which is again giving rise to what is the supervisor doing? What are the typical controls that are there? Problem is similar, but it is reoccurring again and again. Right? He used to cancel the trades right before any kind of confirmations are happening. So thousands of such kind of trades getting into unauthorized trading activity. Probably if I look at getting into all unauthorized trading activities, no supervision, more similar kind of mechanisms for conducting the fraud. Knowing how the middle office and back office works, how the trades are confirmed, have a good idea about all these processes and how I can very well use my fraud. What are the loopholes that are there in the IT systems? Understand them, and probably where all the data can be manipulated, go forward in terms of manipulating the data. This is what this particular person, Kerviel, has actually done. Right? So again, from a bank's perspective, even from an IT system standpoint, if I look at the system is not able to review the trading activity which was entered and cancelled. So probably an efficient system which should understand that particular process. So if there are very high number of cancellation, is there any kind of information that is being provided? Literally no. And probably there are quite a few number of things that have happened there. The assistant, the trading assistant who was there, he also did not report any kind of manipulation, though he has full access to the account. So which means he must have also colluded in the process. And there is a bank's leave policy actually, which is a mandatory leave that everyone have to go for 2 weeks at a stretch. Now, if that had happened, someone else would have come into the place and he could have very much identified the hiding of the transactions and all that stuff. And the problem would have been identified much earlier. But that leave policy was avoided in that particular case, which is again something to be investigated. right? The reporting system which was associated with the collaterals and the cash accounts, it was not up to the mark, and completely investigations and controls to monitor the trading activity was not in place at all. So a simple way, if I look at, okay, though he has placed large number of cancellation of the orders, nothing is flagged. So which means trades are getting, and no review typically associated with any of them, and no confirmations with the counterparties, because they are all fictitious trades. Things were moving further just like that. So whether the trades were real or fictitious, no one was able to identify them. And especially there was a change of manager in the middle, and this guy had to take a very good advantage of it. So when there is a change in the management, or when there is a change in the supervisor, what kind of controls have to be in place? They are nothing much in place. And the gross to net position was abnormally high, which means there could be a lot of unauthorized trading activity, but no one has sensed it. And the vacation rule typically did not get enforced. So, and profit and loss activity, if you are looking at, it is completely abnormal, but no one had really questioned it. No investigation, no comparison with respect to peers, no comparison with respect to forecasted values. Now, all this is giving rise to nothing but operations risk, and this operations risk has resulted the bank somewhere around 4.9 billion euros. Can you imagine that? Now that is where the operations risk management and the mechanism to identify, quantify, prioritize, mitigate, monitor kind of risk management process has to be implemented. So there is a lot of concealing and fictitious, probably a story more and more similar to that of Barings Bank, where Nick Leeson has done more or less similar activity, and even after 11 years of occurrence of that, the activity got reported in a similar manner. So that is where a good understanding of the external data, as well as how well I can use it for improving my risk management activity, need to be understood and appreciated, right?